I spent my whole life believing that family meant love. But that was a lie. My own sister, Serafina, stood before hundreds of guests and tried to rip my world apart. All because she couldn't stand to see me happy. My parents, blind and complicit, let her cruelty fester, pushing me aside like I was disposable. The betrayal cut deep, but watching them crumble under their own deception, that was justice. And yet, they still thought I'd forgive. I stood before the grand mirror in the bridal suite of the Fairmont Copley Plaza, adjusting the delicate lace sleeve of my gown. The reflection staring back at me should have looked radiant. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, a strange unease coiled in my stomach. My name is Venus Carter, and today, I am marrying the man of my dreams, Elijah Hayes, in a wedding that feels like it was pulled from the pages of a fairy tale. The ballroom is adorned with white roses, the chandeliers gleaming like falling stars, and over 200 guests have gathered to celebrate us. But something is wrong. Behind me, lounging on the velvet sofa, my sister, Serafina Carter, scrolled through her phone, her champagne-colored bridesmaid dress draped elegantly over her crossed legs. To the world, she was charming, adored, a social media icon who thrived in the spotlight. To me, she was something else, a shadow that had followed me my entire life. Always lurking, always waiting. I knew she wasn't happy for me. But what I didn't know was that today, she would take her resentment to a level one never imagined, turning my wedding into a nightmare I would never forget. The ceremony had been flawless. The vows exchanged, the rings slipped onto our fingers, and the final words that sealed our union had been met with thunderous applause. I had walked down the aisle with my father's steady arm guiding me, his rare softness filling me with reassurance. And at the end of that walk had been Elijah, strong, unwavering, the man I had chosen. As we stepped into the grand ballroom for our reception, I allowed myself to believe, just for a moment, that nothing could ruin this night. But then, Serafina stood up. At first, I barely noticed. I was laughing at something Elijah whispered when she casually lifted her champagne glass and made her way toward the stage. The room dimmed slightly as the chandeliers cast a golden glow over the space, making everything feel dreamlike. That was the last moment of peace I would have. Good evening, everyone. Serafina's voice rang through the speakers, carrying the same practiced charm she used on her social media followers. The murmur of the crowd quieted. I frowned. There had been no planned speech from her. Before we all get lost in celebrating, I think we should take a moment to acknowledge something very, very important. A pause. The air in the room shifted. Serafina turned toward Elijah, her lips curving into a smile that wasn't meant to be kind. Elijah, I have to ask you something. Are you sure, really sure, that you chose the right sister? The world tilted. A gasp rippled through the crowd. My chest constricted, my hands going ice cold. Elijah stiffened beside me, his grip on my fingers tightening like a vice. My father shot up from his chair, his voice sharp. Serafina, enough. But Serafina wasn't done. She turned to me now, her expression the picture of mock sympathy. Because, dear sister, she purred, her voice dripping with cruelty, I could have had him first. And let's be honest, I think we all know who he really deserves. The room shattered around me. The betrayal sliced deep. This wasn't just sabotage, this was war. The ballroom fell into stunned silence. A few guests exchanged hushed whispers, their eyes darting between me, Elijah, and Serafina, as if trying to piece together a scandal they hadn't been expecting. I sat frozen, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. Every part of me wanted to lash out, to demand why she would do something so cruel. But I knew better than to give her the reaction she craved. Instead, I turned to Elijah. His jaw was tight, his entire body rigid with barely contained fury. His grip on my hand never loosened, never wavered. That alone steadied me. I could see it in his eyes. Serafina had miscalculated. This wasn't going to go the way she thought. Serafina, of course, wasn't done. She took a sip of her champagne, feigning innocence as she tilted her head. "Oh, don't look so shocked, Venus," she said, voice syrupy sweet. "You always knew, didn't you, that I had options, that men always found me more exciting?" A few scattered gasps. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Horrified, my father looked ready to pull Serafina off the stage himself. But she kept going, basking in the chaos she had created. "Elijah, darling," she continued, shifting her gaze to him now. "You don't have to lie to yourself anymore. You could have had me. You still can. If you..." "Enough." Elijah's voice was calm but carried the weight of a man who had just reached his breaking point. He took a step forward, his presence alone cutting through the thick tension in the room. Serafina flinched, just slightly, but I caught it. "I don't know what kind of sick game you think you're playing," he said, his voice steady, dangerous, "but I'm not a prize to be won. And I would never, never, trade the woman I love for someone as heartless as you." Serafina's smile faltered. For the first time, doubt flickered across her face. Because she had just realized something too late. She hadn't just humiliated me. She had humiliated herself. The air in the ballroom was thick with tension, but I refused to let it suffocate me. Serafina had thrown her worst at me, believing she could shatter me with her cruelty. But she underestimated me. She had spent years trying to make me feel small, as if I had no right to shine in my own light. But tonight, something inside me snapped, not in defeat, but in defiance. I wasn't going to let her rewrite my story. I stood up, my spine straight, my voice unwavering. "Serafina," I said, my tone calm, cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "You've spent your whole life trying to take what isn't yours. My achievements, my joy, my confidence, and now, you thought you could take my happiness. But let me tell you something, you will never succeed." Serafina's smirk twitched, faltering under my words. She had expected tears, humiliation, maybe even rage, but she hadn't expected me to rise. The guests were watching, their eyes flickering between us, waiting to see how I would respond to her cruelty. I could feel the weight of their expectations, the pressure to crumble, to let this moment define me. But I wouldn't give her that victory. I turned to Elijah, whose gaze was locked onto mine, unwavering. His hands reached for me, not to steady me, but to stand beside me. He didn't see me as fragile or broken. He saw me as the woman he loved, unshaken, unbreakable. And so, I lifted my chin and let my voice carry through the room. "You may have tried to ruin my wedding, but you failed. You see, Serafina, I don't need your approval. I don't need your validation. And I sure as hell don't need your permission to be happy." A murmur rippled through the crowd, turning into quiet applause, then louder. A slow build of support, of admiration. I felt the warmth of it, the weight of the moment shifting in my favor. Serafina had tried to break me. Instead, she had given me the perfect opportunity to prove her wrong. The days following the wedding were a whirlwind of emotions. The world had seen Serafina for who she truly was, and there was no turning back. Yet, even after her public humiliation, she had the audacity to reach out, spinning apologies laced with excuses. As if an "I'm sorry" could erase the chaos she had created. I didn't respond. I refused to be pulled back into her game of manipulation. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my life, my peace, my happiness. Elijah and I took some time away from the noise, retreating to the countryside where the air was free of whispers and judgment. We spent our mornings drinking coffee on the terrace, watching the sun melt into golden hues over the rolling hills. I reveled in the simplicity of it all, the peace that came with knowing I had nothing to prove anymore. For so long, I had measured my worth against Serafina's approval, against my parents' neglect, against the expectations placed on me since childhood. But now, I realized something revolutionary. I didn't need their validation. I was enough, without their praise, without their approval, without their acceptance. One evening, as I sat by the fireplace, scrolling through the countless messages of support from friends and distant relatives. I came across a letter from my mother. I hesitated before opening it, my fingers trembling ever so slightly. Venus, I don't know if you'll ever forgive Serafina. I don't even know if you'll forgive me. But I do know that I failed you. I let her take too much. Hurt you too deeply. And I stood by, doing nothing. I see that now. And I'm sorry. For the first time in my life, my mother acknowledged her mistakes. But forgiveness wasn't something that could be handed out like a party favor. It had to be earned. And for once, I wasn't the one desperate to make amends. They were. And I was going to take my time deciding whether they deserved it. The moment of vindication came when I least expected it. I had spent weeks ignoring Serafina's desperate messages, watching as the carefully constructed empire she had built around deception crumbled beneath her. The whispers in high society turned into outright condemnation, and the brands that once begged for her endorsements quietly cut ties. The woman who had thrived on curated perfection had become a public disgrace. Then, one evening, as I sat in my new home, a space Elijah and I had chosen together, free from the toxic shadows of my past, my phone rang. I almost ignored it, but something in me wanted to hear what she had to say. Venus, please. Her voice was raw, stripped of its usual arrogance. I said nothing, let her stew in the silence. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I let out a quiet laugh. Didn't mean for it to go this far? My voice was calm, controlled. Serafina, you planned my downfall. You plotted against me, hoping to ruin my life. You humiliated yourself, not me. There was a long pause. For the first time, she had nothing to say. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. The person I had once feared, the sister who had loomed over me like a shadow my entire life, was now nothing more than a defeated voice on the other end of a phone call. So, what do you want? I finally asked. She hesitated. I don't have anyone else. The weight of her words should have made me feel something. Pity, sympathy, a sliver of regret. But all I felt was satisfaction. For years, I had bent over backward trying to prove myself, trying to be good enough for a family that had never truly seen me. And now, Serafina was the one looking for a lifeline. That's not my problem, I said, my voice firm, unwavering. Goodbye, Serafina. And with that, I ended the call, and the last piece of power she held over me. The weight of my family's expectations had always pressed down on me like an invisible chain. One I had carried for far too long. But now, standing in my own home, free from the poisonous whispers of my past, I realized I was finally ready to break those chains for good. The final severance came in an envelope, an invitation. My parents were hosting a charity gala, their annual attempt at maintaining the illusion of prestige. And they wanted me there. More importantly, they wanted me to pretend that nothing had happened, that my sister's betrayal hadn't been broadcast to the world, that Serafina hadn't tried to take everything I had worked for, that my mother and father hadn't stood silently by, watching me suffer. I stared at the invitation, its embossed gold letters gleaming under the chandelier light. Once, I would have felt obligated to go, to play the role of the dutiful daughter, to give my parents what they wanted, a perfect, smiling image of a family that never truly existed. Not anymore. Instead of RSVPing, I ripped the invitation in half. It was such a simple act, but the symbolism was profound. What are you going to do now? Elijah asked, his voice steady beside me. He had been my anchor through the storm, the only person who had never wavered in his belief in me. I looked up at him, my lips curling into a slow smile. I think it's time I start living for myself. The realization was liberating. For years, I had allowed my family's manipulation to define my choices, their judgment to shape my sense of self-worth. But their approval was no longer something I needed, or even wanted. I wasn't just walking away from their world. I was building my own. That night, as I poured myself a glass of wine and listened to the distant hum of the city below. I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. No more guilt. No more obligation. No more being the family's second choice. I was finally free. For years, my life had been dictated by others, my parents' expectations, Serafina's relentless need to overshadow me, and the suffocating weight of their approval. But standing in my new office, the keys to my own future in my hands, I realized I had taken back control. Instead of bowing to the pressure of my family's reputation, I had poured every ounce of my energy into something that was truly mine. My own business, a consulting firm dedicated to forensic psychology and high-profile litigation cases. It was a field where my expertise wasn't just acknowledged but respected. A place where my intellect, my voice, and my experience held real power. No more playing the supportive role. No more standing in the shadows while Serafina basked in the limelight. No more sacrificing my dreams just to maintain a fragile peace. The moment I signed my first major contract, a case so high-profile it would cement my firm as a leader in the industry, I felt something shift deep inside me. I had done this, not my family, not their influence, me. Elijah was there when I stepped into my sleek, modern office for the first time. He watched as I ran my fingers over the polished mahogany desk, taking in the view of the city skyline stretching out before me. "You did it, Venus," he said, his voice filled with admiration. "You built this on your own." I turned to him, a slow, confident smile forming on my lips. No one can take this from me now. It wasn't just about professional success. It was about self-worth. About proving to myself that I didn't need validation from people who had never truly valued me. I had built something for myself, by myself. That night, as I locked my office and stepped into the bustling city streets, the cool night air wrapped around me like a promise. I was no longer just the girl from the Carter family. I was Venus Carter, unstoppable, unshaken, and finally, free. The echoes of my past clung to me like stubborn shadows, but I was done living beneath them. The Carter name, once a golden ticket I had been expected to worship, was nothing more than a weight I refused to carry any longer. My entire life, I had been told that family came first, that blood was thicker than water, but what they had really meant was that Serafina came first. And I was expected to make peace with whatever was left. Not anymore. When I received an invitation to a lavish Carter family gala, I knew exactly what it was: a desperate attempt at reconciliation. A way for them to weave me back into their carefully curated image. But I had no interest in playing the role of the quiet, compliant daughter ever again. Instead, I did something no one expected. I sent back the invitation, declining with nothing more than a polite, two-word response: "Not interested." And with that, I closed the door on the life I had left behind. That night, as I sat on my balcony overlooking the city, sipping a glass of wine, Elijah joined me, his presence grounding me. He didn't need to ask if I was okay, he already knew. He simply slid a hand over mine and whispered, "You don't owe them anything." And he was right. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting to be seen, to be loved, to be enough for people who had never truly valued me. I was building my own legacy, my own future, with people who truly respected and supported me. No more chasing approval, no more begging for a seat at their table. I had built my own, and it was more than enough. The Carter family had spent their entire lives carefully constructing a legacy of wealth, power, and social dominance, but like any grand estate built on deception, it was only a matter of time before the foundation crumbled. And crumble it did. News of Serafina's schemes had spread like wildfire through the city's elite circles, staining the Carter name with scandal. The very people who once worshipped her social status and flawless facade were now whispering about her downfall, shaking their heads at her desperation. But what made it truly poetic was that she had done it to herself. The final blow came when Serafina's engagement, the grand spectacle she had sacrificed everything to secure, fell apart in the most public way possible. Her fiancé, Alexander Blackwell, Boston's most sought-after investment heir, was no fool. Once he uncovered the evidence of her betrayal, the lies, the manipulation, the orchestrated PR campaigns, he didn't just call off the wedding. He humiliated her in front of the very people she sought to impress. At a high-profile charity gala, where Serafina had planned to make her grand re-entry into society, Alexander took the stage, his voice smooth but ice-cold as he addressed the crowd. "A marriage is built on trust," he said, his gaze fixed on Serafina. "And unfortunately, I've learned the hard way that trust is a currency she doesn't possess." The collective gasp of the guests sent shivers down my spine. Serafina stood frozen, her face pale, her lips trembling as if willing herself to wake from a nightmare. But this wasn't a dream. This was justice. Her dream life, her perfect future, had shattered into irreparable fragments. She had once looked down on me, treated me as lesser, unworthy. Now, the tables had turned. I didn't celebrate her downfall. But I wouldn't mourn for her either. She had spent her life stepping on others to climb higher, only to fall from a height so great that no one was there to catch her. And for the first time, I felt truly free. The fallout from Serafina's public humiliation rippled through every corner of high society. But for the first time, it wasn't my concern. I wasn't cleaning up after her. I wasn't standing in her shadow. I wasn't sacrificing my peace to fix a mess I had no part in creating. I was free. In the weeks that followed, my life took on a new rhythm, one untouched by the weight of my sister's manipulations or my parents' impossible expectations. My husband, Damien, and I spent mornings drinking coffee on our terrace, watching the city wake up beneath us. For once, I wasn't strategizing my next move, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for Serafina's next act of sabotage. I was simply living. I turned down social events where people only cared about whispers of the Carter scandal. I stopped answering my mother's thinly veiled attempts to manipulate me back into the fold. I chose where I invested my time, my energy, my love, and I chose me. But Serafina? She had finally tasted what it felt like to be unwanted. The woman who had spent her entire life clinging to the illusion of perfection had lost everything. With her engagement shattered, her reputation in ruins, and her carefully curated image now the laughingstock of high society, she had no place left to run. Even our parents, the same people who had spent decades protecting her, were nowhere to be found. They had spent years grooming Serafina to be their perfect golden child. But now that she was nothing more than a scandal with a designer handbag, they discarded her like an outdated fashion trend. I would have felt sorry for her, if she had ever shown me an ounce of mercy when I needed it. One evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, my phone vibrated. A message. Blocked number. Serafina, I know I don't deserve forgiveness. But I don't know where else to turn. I lost everything. Venus. I just need someone to talk to. I stared at the message for a long time, emotions warring inside me. A part of me wanted to believe she had changed, that her downfall had taught her something. But another part of me, the part that had spent a lifetime watching her take, manipulate, and destroy, knew better. I didn't reply. I deleted the message. Serafina would have to learn the hard way that some wounds can't be undone. And for once, I wasn't the one who had to heal her. A year had passed since that fateful night. The night Serafina finally faced the consequences of a lifetime spent stepping on others. But for me, that night was more than just her downfall, it was the beginning of my rise. I had spent my whole life being told who I should be. A perfect daughter, a silent sister, a woman who made sacrifices so others could shine. But when I finally stepped out of the shadows, I realized something. I was meant to shine, too. In the months that followed, I built something greater than the life my family had always tried to box me into. I expanded my career, launching a psychological consulting firm specializing in high-profile legal cases. Instead of simply being the young professor who impressed boardrooms, I became the woman they called first when reputations, Businesses and legacies were on the line. I traveled. I spoke at conferences. I wrote my first book, not a single page about my sister. Damien and I moved into a home by the water, where the sound of the waves wasn't just background noise but a reminder of my journey, of my resilience, of the battles I had won, and most importantly, of the woman I had become. Venus Carter, not the forgotten daughter, not the lesser sister, not the one who was always expected to give. Just me. Whole, unapologetic, and finally, free.